We're here to talk about A Simpler Time, which, congratulations, is a beautiful book, really is. It takes us back to Australia in the 1960s and early 70s when you were a child and teenager. And there are so many wonderful memories in this book. I believe that you can thank a couple of sisters for being so diligent in keeping an eye on the family history.
It is always an interesting exercise when you're writing a biography. For example, when I was writing Kim Beazley's biography, he signs up for me to intrude into his life, for me to look at his life from backwards and forwards and get letters and diaries, but his wife didn't sign up and his daughters didn't sign up, and that's a very difficult exercise I found over the years in various biographies of living people. At one point, one of my biographical subjects said to me, when he read my manuscript, said to me, look, I'm loving everything, it's all accurate, however, I don't want you to put this particular girlfriend in the book. And I said, well, you shouldn't have lived with her for 6 years, should you? Because, you know, if I'm doing your life, then she's a part of that life, and I insisted. When I'm doing my own, similarly, I'm telling the story of my family's life. I'm the youngest of, well, 6 surviving children, and I'm intimately portraying their lives too, and as well as my aunts and my cousins and uncles. And I was very sure that all of my brothers and sisters were across everything, because they added wonderful, wonderful detail. And so it was a bonding exercise. We're all very, very, very tight as a family, but it was a bonding exercise for us as well. But I made absolutely sure that all of my cousins, each cousin in each family, well, this is what I'm saying about your family. Am I accurate? And is anybody going to be deeply unhappy? I mean, one thing that was quite interesting to me, at one point, one of my cousins, one of my aunts, Auntie Jean, was in the 1940s. She had terrible trouble conceiving, and she went through. Well, she conceived, stillbirth. Finally, the last time she sort of had a breakdown, and my uncle organised to, the way it was in 1940s Australia, adopt another child from the hospital, went home with a child, and I showed that to my cousin Trish, got the details. Yes, absolutely. But my Auntie Mary, took a very grim view of the mentioning of an adoption, and I said, well, Auntie Mary, that's your generation thing. In our generation, it's absolutely, you know, it's equal. So it was an exercise in that there were things that offended some generations, perhaps, but not our generation.
By the end of the book, it's pretty clear that it wasn't a simple and trouble-free life for your parents. Tell us about deciding on the title, A Simpler Time, because am I right in saying that you only thought it was a simpler time?
Well, it's interesting, again, there was family discussion. The actual title, some of you may have seen Australian Story. We all love Australian Story on the ABC. My dear friend was Matt Laffin, and he was, for those who may remember him, he was a literally 3-foot-nothing lawyer, and he had spina bifida, a version of that, and he was a fantastic man and a fantastic friend of mine, and he read all my books over the years, and he said to me, you know, and I mentioned to him, I've got an idea I might do my life. You know, I said, look, I grew up the youngest of 7 children on the farm. My mother was a saint, my father was a very good man, and he was a saint too. You know, both war veterans, started up, cleared the land, and basically on this farm just north of Sydney they grew oranges, lemons, tomatoes and children. And I was the biggest of the children that they grew. And so I'd mentioned to Matt that I had this idea, A Simpler Time, to encapsulate that time of growing up in 1960s Australia, and he wouldn't let it go. He kept coming back to me saying, you've got to write that. Yep. He said, yep, Kingsford Smith, yep, love it. Les Darcy, yep, but write that one. So that was the idea. But my sister, Trish, who's an academic up in Queensland, her point to me, and she laboured it, was we only thought it was a simpler time. It was not a simpler time. It was our mother taking whatever black cloud was on the horizon and keeping it from us. And my point was, my father suffered from such severe depression, perhaps I think from the courtesy of the war, but such severe depression that in the early 1960s he had to have that dreadful electroshock therapy. You know, so that was serious depression. I blithely cruised through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. It was 1987. I was 26 years old before I had any idea that Dad had any trouble. And Mum kept it from us. And we had, as I describe in the book, Mrs. Miles in the house, who was a woman who heard voices, and she would respond to those voices and she would swear at them. And so, and Cyril Summerskill, who lived just down the road, he was also had been in Morisset Mental Hospital. So in that tiny track, regional track, there were maybe 15 people living. 3 of them had had such severe depression or troubles they'd spent time in a mental hospital. Me knew nothing of it.
You found out about your father's depression, as you said, when you were an adult. Now that you know, can you look back at those days and see any signs of it or not? Was your mother that good at
an ever so slight detachment would be how I would describe it, because there was, I can never remember if it's Librium or lithium. There were pills. There was little pills that he would take to sort of get through. But he was I write in the end of the book that all of us look at our parents, the parenting we have received, and compare it to the parenting we give. I am under absolutely no illusions. I do not measure up to the parenting I do. I concentrate on my parenting, and I say I've got 2 beautiful children and 1 other. But
is that the middle child?
Well, it changes as the time goes by, but they're going well. But my point is that I'm not the equal of my father as a father, but I would give my children 5 times more hugs in a week and kisses in a week than I received from him. And I think that was perhaps that generation. When I lived for a long time in France, and the French people are very tactile. You know, everybody shaking hands or kissing on both cheeks and hugging. Somehow when I got back from France, I'd physically hunger to grasp my father, hold him tighter. And yeah, it was not, but that generation, it wasn't just him, I think that generation was far more standoffish. I remember Dad at the age of 7 or 8. I would kiss Dad goodnight. I suspect on the lips, I think, I'm not sure, but at 7 or 8 being said, no more. You know, I mean, not in any unpleasant way, but you grew up, and whereas I sort of missed that.
Well, let's talk about love, and in particular your parents' courtship, because this is, it's an agonising tale from your father's perspective, because as you said, they both went to the war, they came back, they met, and then your mum took off again, I think it's in 1947, to go and see parts of the world. Before she went away, he popped the question to her, and she did not give an answer.
And in many ways, it was a relationship between the right side of the tracks and the wrong side of the tracks. My mother, she was born to a very wealthy man. My grandfather was very wealthy, and he made a lot of money out of wool broking. And his famous line was, "There is nothing so good for business as a good war in a cold country." That's where you sold lots of wool. So he made a lot of money in Korea, for example. And Dad, so Mum lived the best of everything in the mansion at Oakfield, which was, well, there's dispute in the family whether it was a mansion. I can tell you it was a mansion. You know, they had the first Cadillac in Australia, or one of the first Cadillacs in Australia. They had the first washing machine, this newfangled thing called a washing machine. You know, there was somebody to do the garden and drive, and there was Dad living 500 yards away, not living like that at all, but had so poor he had to leave school in the final year to make a quid. Anyway, he fell in love with my mother after they got back from the war. And when Dad decided, having been at El Alamein and in the open desert Syria and so forth, didn't want to go back to what he was trained for, to be an accountant in an office. To face the round eternal of the tax book and the journal. Did not want to do that. Wanted to get out in the open air. So he went up to an orchard to start to train to dig ditches and work out picking oranges and tomatoes, falling in love with my mother while my mother was off on the grand tour. Instead of her sisters had done the grand tour of Europe, well, she and her other sister did the grand tour of Canada and Australia and America, Niagara Falls. And we have the letters of my father writing to my mother saying, "Will you marry me? Will you marry me?" And Mum sort of, you know, not yet, but weakening. And then the beautiful letter, if I may say, of when Mum finally says yes, and Dad's lines that break your heart. He said, he says, "Yeah, you mean it. My bête noire is removed. Thank you, darling. When I got your letter, I said, I fell to my knees and I thanked God who had sent you. May you always walk in the sunshine." You know, and it was just beautiful. And then he said he started singing an aria, and I did not know that man. I did not know that the man that came through, the passionate man in that letters. I knew a very, very good man, a fantastic man, but not that You know,
Yes.
that man, I didn't know that man.
Your mum said that she would have lived with your father in a cave. I had the love of a good man, and that was enough for me.
Yeah.
Oh, that is just
That's what
beautiful.
she said. And when my Auntie Dorothy, who was I'm never quite sure, is the word dowager? What's a dowager? D-O-W-A-G. A very wealthy, very strong woman, terrific woman.
Yes.
But she would come up and visit, and the first time she came up to visit her niece, Helen, who'd married and moved into this shack. And at one point, you know, she'd said they'd had lunch together, and she had said to my mother, you know, Helen, where are the facilities? And my mother basically had to say, it is the Thunderbox, 3 trees down, 2 over, and Auntie Dorothy could make the ABC logo with her lips. And she just couldn't, you know, and it was raining, and my mother had to hold the umbrella, and Auntie Dorothy, those ABC logo was set in stone for 2 years after. Couldn't believe, but the thing I loved, I mean, my brothers and sisters, when we talk about our mother, we think she was a secular saint. You know, there was when we were Sunday school teaching and so forth, and Dad would acquaint us with the concept, not original sin, but the idea that we're all born sinners, you know, and we've got to give our lives to God and all that. And as a little boy, I'd think, well, I'm a bit sinful, and I know Trish, my sister, is a bit sinful, and you know, I think I saw my brother Andrew smoking once, but I couldn't believe it of my mother. I could not believe it of my mother. And my mother, and again, this is not simply my experience, but I think a common experience to us all, and I write about it, that at the age of 4 or 5, I could go in, we'd all sleep on the veranda, I could go into Mum and Dad's bedroom, creep in, and I could say, like this, Mum, just like that, and Mum just instantly, yes, darling. You know, because she was a mother.
Yes.
And she was just attuned that. But at 7 o'clock in the morning, you could have put a locomotive through that bedroom and she wouldn't have stirred. But if it was her children, and she was so totally devoted to us. And, yeah, I mean, it's a thing that I saw Sylvester Stallone. He's coming out with a film called The Expendables or something or other. And he was interviewed on television this morning, and he was saying, look, we're all so expendable that I see, you know, John Wayne dies, and for 2 days everybody mourns, and then just move on, somebody fills in. And yet I think with all my brothers and sisters, with both of my parents, we mourned, but we still mourn. You know, anyway, again, not unique to me, but I do feel blessed to have had such wonderful parents.
Still on love, I want to talk to you about Diane Watson. She was your first love, and quite frankly,
she's about to come out from behind the curtain, isn't she? There's going to be that voice, Peter, it's me.
She did not deserve you. She gave you nothing, let's be honest. And we can all relate to this. We've all had that sort of a love.
What was the name of your boy when you were in primary school that you loved that didn't love you?
I'm ashamed to say that my sort of story of love that's not reciprocated it happened at university when I saved a seat in the Politics 1 lecture theatre for the same man for 3 semesters. And he never sat there. And he remains nameless.
Name him and shame him.
And
is that man now the father of your children?
No, he moved on. But we can all relate to that experience of having one-way love. And yours, though, you went to try and find her as well.
I loved her. She was like with Charles Schultz, with Charlie Brown, the little red-headed girl up front, and mine was Diane Watson. And I just loved her from afar. And she used to have that hairband, a green hairband that would go up, and her hair would sort of bob as she walked along. And she treated me like dirt, and I loved that. I absolutely loved that. And then the greatest day in my young life came when Johnny Phildisis was swinging and with the softball bat, and Diane was walking too close, and he hit her in the head and dropped her like a sack of spuds. And it was wonderful because I was the one that got to her, lifted her up, and she leaned her perfumed head on my shoulder, and I escorted her to the headmaster's office. And the headmaster called, and I just stood. I was in that sort of thing of strong and silent. I was just hovering outside the door, being strong and silent, thinking surely she will notice how strong and how silent I am. And then the terrible news came that she was moving, and she was going up to, her father was the mobile service station proprietor, and they were moving up to Charlestown. And I can still remember the day of her getting in the bus, and she was waving at all the girls and even other boys. Me, nary a wave. And I love that. I love that. Well, I was breaking my heart, but to make a long story short, when I was 16 years old, I mean, I look back upon how trusting my parents were. When I said at 16 I'm hitchhiking up to Queensland, Mum and Dad said, OK.
I couldn't believe that.
I couldn't believe that now looking back upon it either. I mean, one of the themes of the book is the things that our parents allowed us to do because they were trusting. And the idea, as I put in the book, that at the age of 4 or 5 I was climbing trees, 6 or 7 I was driving tractors, 8 or 9 I was pulling up half-ton bins of oranges, and it never changed. At the age of 22, 23, I called my father on a scratchy line from Khartoum in the Sudan, and I said, "Oh, Dad, just touching base. I'm going through Uganda. Look, there's been a bit of a civil war there, but it seems to have settled down, and I found a couple of truck drivers. I'm giving them $20 and they're going to take me through, and I'll call you when I get to Nairobi." And my father said, "OK, son, good, OK, well, call us when you get there." and if my boys called me at that age, I'd be actually thrilled that they were out there and amongst it. I would nevertheless say, "You are doing no such thing. You will stay in that phone box. I will be there in the Channel 9 helicopter within 20 minutes. You know, do not move." But with Diane, so at 16 I did hitchhike up and slept on the steps of Coffs Harbour Town Hall, and I inquired around because I somehow had found out that she was in a hair salon, being a hairdresser. Anyway, I went in and I looked like somebody had slept there overnight, and I'm waiting, and the woman says, "Would like a haircut?" "Yes." And she said, "All right, well, I'll do it." I said, could I have that girl? Because it was Diane. Anyway, I got out my $5 that I'd saved up there and gave it to her, and at some point she had to take my name or something, and she worked out it was me, and I went, "Yes, it's me. Basically, I've been loving you for the last 8 years," and she treated me like dirt, and I loved that.
Do you know, there's so much humour in this. The part when she leaves the local area to, as you said,
Yes.
to go to another service station, you have to choose between being strong and silent or declaring your love, and hopefully she'll want you more. And you say in the book, "More of what? I'm not quite sure," because she barely spoke to you.
And in terms of one of the things I did with this book is, and again, everybody has got people that were significant to them 30 and 40 years ago. You probably 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago.
Very kind.
But we've got people that were significant to us, and it was a delight for me to track them down and to talk about events that were seminal in my life and ask it from their perspective. And one of my favourite ones is there was a beautiful woman, a young woman, 24 years old, Evelyn Breeze, who lived at Breezes Road, and it was her father that the road was named after. Anyway, she was beautiful. I'm talking Miss Woy Woy, 1965. And she suddenly disappeared, maybe 1967 or 68, for 6 months, and she came back, and within a week her parents suddenly adopted a baby. And her father was 70 and her mother was 52, but they decided, yes, we're having a foster child. Everyone went, OK. Anyway, as the years went by, the baby grew, Greg, and he looked exactly like Evelyn. And nobody said anything because that was 1960s and 1970s Australia. Anyway, I tracked her down and we had a cup of tea at Corindi. And I said to her, "Look, I'm writing this book, and look, this is why I'm here. I don't want to intrude upon anybody's personal life, but I have always assumed that Greg is your son, and I'd like to put it in the book." And she put down her cup of tea, she got a serviette and dabbed her lips, and she looked at me and she said, "In 42 years, nobody has ever asked me that question. But yes, he is my son, and I want you to put it in that book." And it was terrific, yes, because that was a part of those times. And there were many examples of that, and I couldn't find Diane Watson. And I'm hoping somebody in Coffs Harbour or Lower Whoop Whoop or Upper Whoop Whoop will point it out to her, and I'll get a phone call. And I'd just love to. I'm not still holding a candle all these years later. I'm married. Many of you may know my wife, Lisa Wilkinson, who's co-host of the Today Show, and that actually makes me the president of the Australian Men Punching Well Above Their Weight Club. Nice to see so many of my fellow members here tonight. But I'm very happily married. But I would love, one of those things.
Look, and if this was a commercial television show, she would pop out from behind there, wouldn't she?
They did that. You know that thing? They did in 2003. They did This Is Your Life on me.
Yes. And
it was stunning because you never think. I haven't watched much of This Is Your Life, but somebody told me at the end of it that Spike Milligan, the only person that's ever refused, they said to Spike Milligan, "Spike Milligan, this this is your life. And Spike Billigan said, no, it's not. Taxi! I just walked out.
That's hilarious. Now, your parents taught you a lot of life lessons, but not so much in a boring way. There were poems, there were ditties, there were aphorisms, and as
Son, most of the work of this world, Dad would always say, if I'd say I'm a bit crook today, Dad, I don't want to pick oranges, Dad would say, son, most of the work of this world is done by people who feel a little crook. And those sort of aphorisms, they get into your soul. Of a little, have a little, and be thankful too.
Yes.
When we'd have visitors over and there wasn't enough scones to go around, FHB, family hold back. And all of those things, and I constantly say all of those things to my children, and they understand them. And Dad would teach us Rudyard Kipling. I mean, we in the tomato shed, he'd teach us poetry, so the long nights, and if the one that I used to love, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. And that kind of stuff, it insinuates itself into your soul. When I was about to play Test rugby for the first time, I'm just lying there, just repeating it, getting strength from it. And I think all of that stuff, yeah.
And the Gettysburg Address and the Ned Kelly story.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are met on a great, etc., etc. I'm speaking in Washington, D.C. in 3 weeks, and I've been practising. I'm going to knock their socks off.
There's a moment in the book when you see a baby chicken struggling to get out of its shell, and that, you say, is a little bit like the way your parents brought up the kids. I mean, they were pragmatic in a lot of ways, but also incredibly compassionate people as well.
It's interesting, that scene you described, because it's one of those memories I'm not absolutely... It's made a big impression upon me, but when I go back, I Googled it to see, the idea was the little... I have this specific memory of a tiny little chick trying to work its way out of the shell. All the other little chickens were running around, and me reaching down to help it out, and Dad pulling me back and saying, no, it's got to get the strength. It's getting out of the shell that it'll get its strength to run around. And it's locked in my memory, and I Googled it, and there's no other record of anybody else having that memory, so I think it must be my memory. No, seriously, seriously, in that kind of thing, and that's one of my themes, is that I can remember things from well before I was born, so that just as we all remember our first kiss or our first day at work or our first day at school, I can also remember my grandfather charging across the veldt in the Boer War. I can remember Dad writing to Mum in 20 years before I was born. That sense of, because they all live in the same place in our head, and it's always fascinated me how I think our memory works, that if you look at a glass of lemonade, look where the bubbles come from. They don't come from the corners, they don't come from right in the middle at the bottom, they just come from random spots. And I have these stupid little memories that just keep floating to the surface, and they pop, pop, pop. And part of the process, I know you're writing your book, and a dear friend of mine, Susie's writing her book, and that was part of my process of writing this book, was to gather the pops. Think, I've been thinking about that every day for the last 40 years. Why have I been thinking about that stupid little moment? And yet, one of the ones I describe is that I just got this clear memory of being 4 or 5 years old, and Dad... It was getting dark, and we were down by the old white gum, and Dad got one of the saplings, one of the seedlings of orange trees, and get his big pick stick, a penknife, and opened it up, and we planted it. And then Dad would always say to me, like an Indian, son. And so like an Indian was to run around the sapling with your feet going woo, 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 and then Dad would do the same, and we were going woo, 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 and maybe for 2 minutes we were doing that. And I think of that every day of my life. And then the lovely thing for us is that when Dad died, we buried him, his ashes, exactly where he dropped, on the farm, in the most beautiful spot on the farm. And all our brothers and sisters, all of our spouses, all of our children, we plant Dad there, and we got a big Robinia sapling, we put it in, we put the water around it, then we all looked at each other and we went...
He died with his boots on, as you say in the book.
He did. He died with his boots on. And, again, I look at the process of parenting, I mean, how they created 6 of us that all adore each other and look after each other, and, you know, not that we are not without our problems. You know that lovely line from Hillary Clinton where she said it takes a village to raise a child. The idea being it's not just mum and dad and, you know, focus, it's people around. Now, all of us, we've got 13 kids between us, and there have been various times when our kids and ourselves have stumbled and fallen, and we all... But much easier in the age of email, I must say, with one of our children, all points bulletin, I need help on this. And we're all there and we sort it all out and everything. And somehow mum and dad, you know, you mentioned the aphorisms and giving us the values. Never made a motivational speech, ever. And there was never a harangue. I make 3 motivation speeches a day before breakfast to all of my children for no visible effect.
Talk about trusting your parents. Your mum never locked the house.
No.
And they welcomed warmly a man called Fred who didn't wash. And he stayed at your place for a long time.
See, these are the days. My 3rd book was called Hitchhiking for Ugly People. And because I'd done a lot of hitchhiking, I fancied myself as Australia's best hitchhiker.
Would you let your kids hitchhike today?
No, I'd certainly not let my daughter hitchhike. But my boys... Look, it just doesn't happen anymore. Ivan Milat stopped hitchhiking. I think single-handedly you just never see a hitchhiker anymore. But my mother was incapable of driving past somebody with their hand out. And one day there was this man called Fred, and it was getting dark, and it was at Asquith, and she sees this man, and she stops and he says, "Can I have a ride?" in a very thick European accent. And he said, "Can I bring some of the furniture or stuff with me?" Mum says, "OK." So there was Fred, getting dark. She was the one woman in Australia that would stop, who had an empty station wagon, who would allow Fred to then go back and forth and back and forth. Television set, divan, cabinet, coffee table, washing machine, I mean everything. So Mum turns up loaded to the gunnels with this man called Fred, who then moves into, you know, such a process to unload him. Nobody can bear to put it back. So he stays a day, he stays 2 days, stays 3 days. And he ended up staying for months, and we loved him. Trish and I and my sister loved him because of the thick accent and he had a gold tooth, but he didn't. The problem was he didn't wash. He refused to wash, and when he'd been living the life on the road, I suppose the rain, he'd get drenched every now and then. Finally, my father couldn't help but notice that the tomato plants downwind were dying, and insisted that Fred had to have a wash. And Fred, rather than wash, moved on and said, "Well, I'm not going to be treated like a baby. You want me to wash? I'll move on." So he moved on.
The relationship with Trish, who's called Bubs for a lot of the book, is beautiful, and it's perhaps the relationship that I best identify with because my brother and I are as close as that. I love the way that you were it was you two against the world a lot, because you were the youngest, she was the second youngest, and the big thing for you two was you didn't want to become city slickers. You had to stay tough and in the country, and it's gorgeous.
But that was the way it was, that one by one our older brothers and sisters were weak and disloyal and went off to boarding school. You know, and I really felt they were very badly letting the side down, leaving the farm, and then finally the terrible day came that Trish went too, and I was there on my own there for the next 2 years. And I don't know what you thought. I mean, I'm interested in your views, but I described the scene of the killing of the chickens. And I look back upon that as a moment of, not madness, but when I was just about to go to boarding school, I was nearly 11 years old, and the chooks that had been in the pen, by this time they were roaming free on the farm. Anyway, I conceived the notion that we could kill them, and Dad said, "OK." And the idea being we'd eat them. And I look back upon that one day after school. I said, "All right, well, that'll be my chicken." I started chasing after that chicken, and the chicken saw me and go, "Bop, bop, 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 bop." And I'm running after him and thinking, and I'm going through and left and right, and the orange trees are scratching me and I'm falling over, bop, 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 going after him. And then I think, how am I going to stop? And I picked an orange up and started pelting him and hitting him, and I chased him for half an hour until I killed him. And I look back upon that and the brutality of that, and I did that. Where did that madness come from? And I don't know if that was the beginnings of being a rugby player or not, but it was madness.
I could say something about sportsmen, but I won't. I'm too polite. But you felt a bit uncomfortable after you killed the first one.
Yes.
But then you went on your rampage.
It's interesting. Well, at the moment I'm writing the book, The Shipwreck of the Batavia, which I firmly believe is the finest story. Well, I've always said the 2 greatest stories in Australian history are Les Darcy and the shipwreck of the Batavia. And the key figure in this shipwreck of the Batavia, 1629, off the west coast of Australia, is this man called Hieronymus, and that was his point. He gets the mutineers around him, and then they'll threaten to kill 4 of them. They'll kill 3 of the others, of the survivors, and one will say, "I'll do anything." "Oh, will you kill some?" "Yes." And once you've killed one, you're a murderer. It's like you commit adultery once. Well, first time, big deal. Second time, third time. No, not that I've done that, but I'm told.
And then there's Tiger Woods.
That's right.
Let's talk about politics now. As a student of politics, I love the political references in the book and that time in our history. Your dad wanted to be a Liberal Prime Minister, and you say in the book that voting Liberal is in the very marrow of our bones. The part that I love is when your siblings go off to the big smoke, go off to Sydney. They get these notions, these ideas, and they develop strong views about sexism and racism and you know, horror of all horrors, that they become a bit pro-Whitlam as well.
Looking back on that time, and Graham Richardson, the Labor Party guy, said to me a couple of years ago, he said how odd it was, looking back on the history of Australia, how up until, well, all through this century, last century, up until the mid-60s, it was a big deal if you were a Protestant or you were a Catholic. You know, the nation was sort of divided, and he said, his description was, late 60s, Australia woke up and went, well, nobody really cares anymore, and nobody cares at all now. In fact, now the issue, and not for me but for some, is, you know, Islamic or whatever. I'm a very firm atheist for what it's worth. But I had, looking back, sort of channeling or digging back through my past, I always had a suspicion of Catholics. I'm not sure that I knew any, but I thought they must be around me. And it was a big deal because my grandfather was Protestant Irish, had come out, and it was said of my grandfather that, you know, he was absolutely really strong Christian, strong Protestant, and it was said that on his deathbed he suddenly announced that he wanted to convert to Catholicism. And when they said to him why, he said, so that when I die there'll be one less of the bastards. Anyway, but I didn't. My father had no ounce of that kind of bigotry in him. But I at that time, I look back upon it. You know, we'd go to the Protestant white church and we'd pass the green Catholic church with this very suspicious long eaves, and it was something like that. And Labor Party people for me were exactly like that. You know, I didn't like Labor. There were only people that were any good were Liberal Party people, and Labor people were very shifty and very suspicious. And so Dad, as the local Liberal Party president, we would, every federal election, we would go up and down Peteridge, Spencer, Mangrove Mountain, Culnura, handing out how to vote cards, and then on the day we'd sit in Mount White Public School and look very hopefully at everybody coming in and give them how to vote Liberal. And then our nemesis was Barry Cohen, yes, who was the local member, federal member, and always, you know, we'd put up butcher, baker, candlestick maker up against Barry. We'd work all weeks leading up to the election. We'd work all day, then we'd go back to the tomato packing shed, tune into ABC to find out just how badly Barry had beaten us this time. And when I started to write the Beazley biography, first port of call, who understands the Labor Party? Bloody Barry Cohen. So I went to see him, and I said to Barry, one of my first things over lunch was, so tell me, you know, how does a caucus work again? And Barry went, like, I can't believe you're writing a Labor Party biography. But anyway, Kim Beazley, yeah, it's interesting. I asked, in fact, the great nemesis was Gough Whitlam, and when I was launching this book, I thought, who would I like to launch this book? I love Gough Whitlam, and he wanted to, but sadly his health would not allow him, so my wife did it. But yes, the thing you've tapped into is that Peteridge didn't, even though it went on the calendar through the 1960s, the 60s didn't really hit there until about 1969, early 1970, when I had my brothers and sisters going away to university and coming back, and my brother Andrew, going away, 1969, school captain of Knox, short, back and sides, good Liberal Party voting, and then he came back, you know, for the first holidays, and his hair had started to grow, and then an earring appeared.
Oh,
and
yes,
then,
the earring.
And then, you know, and then there was weird, and then he started talking about Labor, and he was angry. He was angry about Vietnam. He was angry about Billy McMahon, our hero. We loved Billy McMahon, but my brother said, and so there was this anger, and then my sister went away, and she came back brandishing this book called The Female Eunuch by somebody called Germaine Greer, and started hitting me around the head with it, saying I had to start washing up. And so there was that thing of the outside world coming into my comfortable little life.
But your oldest brother, who studied engineering, he was conservative.
Very conservative.
And frowned upon what he was watching.
Yes, and there was something, I think, of a division between my two older brothers, because that too was the times. David was an engineer at Sydney University, Andrew was arts. And there's a story, you know, and it's an absolutely true. I'm now on the Senate of Sydney University. In 1969, Sir Roden Cutler, who was a war hero, who was the Governor of New South Wales, was addressing in the quadrangle of Sydney University, was addressing a group, and the art students got word that the famous warmonger, he wasn't a warmonger, but, you know, a representative of those who wanted us to be at Vietnam were there, and the arts, the long-haired Labor voting lefties started to move, and the university was in trouble. Who can we call for? Call for the engineers, and the engineering students came in and pushed the art students away and got the governor into the car, and off he went. And yeah, I love that story because it encapsulates something of the times.
There is so much humour in this book, but the most endearing part for me is your eagerness to become a man. Because you're the baby of the family, and you see the others going away, you want to show them that you're strong and tough. And there's this great moment when you're so proud when your father invites you to help get Bertha, the cow, out of the ditch.
It's lovely. It's close to my first memory. I'm sometimes guilty of using the same phrase book after book because I love it. One of my phrases that I love, the unconscious veil of babydom is sort of lifted. And I think I used that in the Farr Jones book, and I might have used it in the Hills book, and I thought it's such a good phrase, I'll use it in my book.
Don't plagiarise yourself.
That's exactly right. And so when it was peeled away for the first time, I was 3 or 4 years old. I think 4 years old, the phone rings, and my father, my big, strong father, lifts up the phone and says, Yep, okay, yep, Bertha, right, yep, crowbars, yep, shovels, yep, pulleys, okay, all right, Cyril, off we go. And it was the neighbours, and Bertha the cow, Cyril Summerschool's cow, had fallen into a ditch, and they couldn't get him out in the middle of the night, and so Dad got the phone call with my brothers, and there was a sudden movement at the station. You know, the women folk were getting thermoses filled with tea. It was going to be a long night. Sisters are making the sandwiches. Brothers get the Massey Ferguson, James, you get the crowbar. And then Dad said these blessed words, and Woozle, you can come too if you like.
You've made it.
And I'd made it, and the next thing I know, I'm at the back of the ute, and we're tearing down the road, and I remember the two beacons, the bobbing beacons of light from my brother David on the Massey Ferguson behind, and I'm there, and the wind's whipping past me, and my brother Andrew and James, just like Mum had told them, you know, keep Pete safe. So they're holding me tight, and, you know, it was just action, it was movement, it was just us men out there, while the women were back in the homestead, and neither of my sisters liked that account. But that is, I say, well, that is how it was, and that is the way I looked upon it at the time, which was women folk inside, men folk out there doing the hard yards, doing the hard work, and that was the way it was. And I think sometimes too, like I think I've used the line in the book, if I look at the relationship between my parents in a marriage and the relationship I have and my brothers and sisters have with our spouses, in Mum and Dad's relationship, it was Dad was the king, but Mum was the parliament, and that was Mum would decide, but she'd always hand it to the king to stamp off on, and the king would. But that was the way it was, and also, but see, in my relationship with my wife, it's a 50% thing. You know, there's where I'm here, she's there. There's a steering wheel. It's a modern relationship between the two of you, and you've got to work out whose track it is now. And anyway, we all worked it out.
You also formed and led the Secret 3 Detectives, STD, which is very funny, with high hopes for the trio. You had a lot of ambition that group would do a lot of things.
It all came about. Again, I may look like an unlikely fellow to have been bullied, but I was, and I hope I've done justice to the boy that bullied me. I name in the book there's only 3 names that I've changed to just not to embarrass anybody, but I think I called him Bobby McTeer. I'll call him Bobby in the book. And Claudie was not a bad bully, but I was a hypersensitive kid, and he made me miserable. And he was a couple of years older than me, and he was that kind of guy. I think sixth class were the best 4 years of his life. He was that kind of guy that had been just, repeating and so forth. And he wasn't vicious, and he didn't hit me. There was a little bit of, mild willy rubbing. Can I put it like that? In fact, at one point, I was not quite comfortable having my willy rubbing with another boy's willy, but that was a part of what it was. And one of my cousins said to me, said, "Geez, you've been frank. Geez, you've been..." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, well, about the willy rubbing." I said, "Oh, no, I don't think that's particularly, frank." He said, "Oh, we said we've all done it, but you don't write about it." Anyway,
I must admit, I had to reread that bit because I thought, really?
Yeah.
Is that what went on?
I think that is what went on, men. But the point is that Claudie, Bobby, his name was Claudie, but I call him Bobby in the book, terrorised me. And if there was anything that was not the making of me, but if anything, the most seminal moment in my life was me crying to Mum morning after morning after morning, saying, "I don't want to go to school, I don't want to go to school," and Mum inquiring, working out it was because I was terrorised by Claudie, and saying to my sister Trish, "Fix it." And Trish, a big, strong girl, Claudie not so big, said to Claudie, "No, you can't. Leave my brother alone." And Claudie could scowl so that his left lip would touch his nose. And he said, "You've been running to your sister. You've been running to your mummy about us, you little mummy's boy. Your sister's you're kicked out of our gang." And the gang was in the primary school was him and me. I was a part of the 6 boys. This sort of gang. And anyway, I was kicked out for a week. And I remember my exact words, I said, "Oh, Claudie, I'll get her for that. I never said that. No, you're out of our gang." And anyway, for 1 week, one beautiful, blessed week, the sun shone. I didn't have to be around him. I was kicked out of the gang. And after that Friday morning, Claudie said, "All right, you can come back into our gang." And I said, "No, Claudie, I don't want to." And that was the moment. And so instead of being in his gang, I formed the Secret 3 Detectives, which was myself, Jonathan Dyroff, and Jim Radatz, and we were a force for good. And we were solving problems. If anybody's lunch disappeared or whatever, that was what we did. And funny thing with Jonathan, again, somebody that was very important to me at that time, and who, on the final day of school, we all, hugged or did whatever we did and, shook hands and we'll be brothers forever. Never saw him again until at a school reunion at Peteridge Public, like 25 years afterwards. There was Jonathan, and I started to talk to him, and I thought, "Something different about you. What is it? What is it?" And Jonathan said, "And then I gave my life to Jesus Christ." And I said, "Why did you do that, Jonathan?" But anyway, it was good to see him, and I went to see him for this, and we talked. We talk about our lives, and it was for me a fascinating process.
There's an underlying sadness in the book. We learn early on that your brother Martin passed away at a young age.
Yeah.
There's the image of him going through the emergency doors at the hospital, never
to be seen
again. And we don't know what happened until much later in the book, but it hangs around.
Can I ask you what you thought of that, me delaying what happened to Martin? Were you irritated by it, or...? Yeah.
No, because I knew that we'd find out in the end, but I could just sense that it was a heavy presence.
It was the thing. Well, the first Martin was my brother that died in 1959. He had epilepsy, and I'd never really. It was so. My mother and father just never got over it, and the first clue I got as to how desperately grievous the wound was when Jeffrey Aybrook, who was a neighbourhood boy, drowned, and Dad and I went to the funeral. I think, and Mum was there too, but Dad went over to talk to Mr Aybrook, and I just sort of held back, and he was talking to Mr Aybrook, and Dad came back, and it was a sunny day. It was Palmdale Cemetery at Crematorium at Arimba, and I said, "What did you say?" And Dad said to me, I said like this, he said, I said to him that we lost one too. And I said, and then he said, and I said to him, "But, time heals it." And then Dad said, "But it never does. And just my father, the only time, it makes me want to weep to think of it, because my mother and my father never got over it, as I would never get over it. None of us would ever get over it. And I think one of the things again, I wanted to try to encapsulate as the way different generations go about things, that when Martin died, you know, my brothers and sisters and I, first time really inquired what happened, and it was, there is with epilepsy a petit mal and grand mal, and he had a grand mal. He had this major attack, and they said it was like the roaring of an engine. Just couldn't, and Mum and Dad, and they'd come in and they'd see Mum and Dad trying to feed Martin cornflakes, you know, to try to sort of break the circuit, and the crumbs falling down, and they raced him off to hospital, and the idea was that Martin goes through the emergency doors and never see him again, because that was the way of death at that time, although subsequently I found out my mother did see him very briefly. But the point then was that death was for the professionals, and by the time that we got to it, that when Dad died, as I mentioned, dropped on the farm and got the phone call, Sydney Morning Herald, March 16, 1992, picked up my brother Jum, the first days of mobile phones, called ahead, and I said, don't take the body. And these wonderful undertakers stayed, and my mother kept feeding the tea. And I will always cherish, you know, the thing that the time, we had 2 hours with Dad. And I think that is such a human thing to do. It is, you know, I can still remember it, I can still smell his skin and the coldness and weeping and weeping and weeping, and my brother Jum weeping, brothers and sisters weeping. And when Mum died 2 years later, she died at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We did not make the first phone call until 4 or 5 hours later, because it was nobody else's business, you know, in that sense. And I think
all surrounded your mother.
All surrounded her.
Yes.
And in fact, look, for what it's worth, I thought with Mum, when Mum died, we're all singing in Jerusalem. Those will those hills. The sun was going down, and there was Mum on the bed, and it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And Mum's last words to me, like we'd do a bit of singing with Mum. Well, before she died, around, you know, just sort of ease her passage or whatever. And Mum's last words to me, she sort of came out of a coma and looked around to see her children, and she looked at me and she said, "Pete, stop singing." And I tell the story again to try to encapsulate the change in the generations, how deeply conservative Mum's past was, and yet the woman that she was, that when my grandmother Polly, who was from Melbourne, her name was Polly Tout, she travelled across the Pacific Ocean to Vancouver to get to Chicago to meet up with my grandfather, who'd asked for her hand in marriage. He was an Australian wool broker working over there. And here's the story. In 1906, she married my grandfather, got pregnant, and when she was pregnant, she did not know from where the baby would emerge. Stunning. I know, stunning. My surviving aunts, my 97-year-old aunt, Auntie Ida in Edinburgh, and my Auntie Mary, 89, in Tamworth, absolutely confirmed that story. She did not know. It wasn't discussed, because the way it would work back then would be the mother would say to the daughter, "You understand, dear, of course, what happens," or your older sister or whatever. But she was an Australian woman in Chicago with nobody around. So anyway, she found out. And the point being that she'd always say to my mother, "Darling, when they're talking about anything, you walk away." And she walked away. She said to my sisters, "Walk away." I say to my 12-year-old daughter, I do, "Darling, there'll be talk of this, walk away, your grandmother's not here," but this is what she would want to say to you. And so I'm saying it on behalf of her, walk away. And I say to her, there'll come a time for you to know about such things. You will be 35. But the point being that when just the part that I love, and again my Auntie Mary felt a bit grim about this, but the part that I love, 2 days before Mum died, my sisters are helping her on something, and Mum says, "Is there anything you want to ask me?" And my elder sister Kathy said to Mum, "Mum, what's been the best thing in your life?" And Mum said, "Sex with your father." And fantastic. What a fantastic thing. For my generation, what a fantastic thing that after 44 years of marriage, raising 7 children, getting through drought and rain and travelling the world briefly at the end of their life and doing everything they'd done, what a fantastically passionate, wonderful thing to say. Oh, my Auntie Mary does not agree.
Right. I loved that line. It was surprising, and it was terrific. Before we invite questions from the audience, I want to compare now the Peter FitzSimons from then to the man sitting here today. You've mentioned about the religion. You were confused about religion back then. How is God the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost? How does that happen?
Did you work that one out?
No. But I went to a public school, and I didn't really sort of learn too much about it, and quite frankly, I'm happy enough with that. And now you've been described by one of your readers as a barking mad atheist. You'd agree with that?
Totally.
Okay. In the book, you describe yourself as a money-hungry little bastard. You had some issues with the tax system as about an 8-year-old, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. My father explained to me about we'd been spent all days picking oranges, and Dad said he had to go and do the tax books. Could I get the oranges up? And I said, what's the tax system? And he said, oh, well, basically 25 cents or 30% of everything we earn we have to send to Canberra. And I was appalled. And I sort of reduced it to oranges. A third of these oranges go to Canberra, and Dad always said, well, son, that's the way it works to pay for the hospitals, the roads and the police, and your mother and I are very happy to pay our taxes. But that was an appalling moment for me.
You were also smitten by the Queen. You burrowed your way through a crowd to catch a glimpse of her when she came in 1970 to the Royal Easter Show.
Like everybody, there was the image of the Queen everywhere we went, and it was in that lemon dress. And I think, was there an oath or something like that? Yeah.
You say in the book, when you've seen the Queen, we couldn't have been more impressed had she levitated 10 yards into the air and done a gracious and no doubt regal backward somersault in the pike position, degree of difficulty 3.1, before returning to the ground again. What about the man sitting here today?
Absolutely staunch Republican.
Right.
And not only a staunch Republican, I want the wretched Union Jack off our flag. I love the line from Jerry Seinfeld where he came out to Sydney in the year 2000 and he said, I love your flag, Britain at night.
As a 9-year-old, you wanted to be a great Nobel Prize-winning scientist and a great Liberal PM. You said making the Australian people aware of just what sorry, deceitful wretches the Labor Party is composed of.
That's how I felt.
And today?
I'll vote Labor. I do vote Labor. Except I won't vote New South Wales State Labor. They're a disgrace.
Okay. And this is my favourite one. You also wanted to, now listen to this, open the batting and the bowling for Australia, as well as keep the wickets and be captain and even 12th man. You wanted to do everything. And instead, as we know, you played rugby for Australia. Any regrets?
Not at all. I mean, I would love to have. I think most boys at that time of my time wanted to do that with the Australian cricket team. The closest I got 73 not out in the Knox under 14Ds, and I would have got a century if Hugh Sinclair had not taken off for a very selfish run.
Not that you hold a grudge.
No. That was my one chance for a century.
Yes. And of course, through the book, there's that beautiful desire. You won't embrace the big city ways.
And I now live right in the heart of the big city.
Right.
Yeah. But I look at that and I think, of course, I think what my mum and dad would think of the book that I have written. And see, Mum wanted. Look at the secret of her parenting skills, particularly. She said she thought good parents, to make every child think that they were their favourite of their parents. And when I heard her say that, I felt sorry for my brothers and sisters because I knew that I was her only favourite. But in fact, I was far and away the most difficult kid. My mother had said to my brothers and sisters, you must help me raise Pete. I haven't got the strength. I can't do it. And I tell the story in the book. For us, a big deal was Knox Grammar, where there were 17 FitzSimons that went through Knox. 16 of them had been school captains. Four of them had been school captains, 2 vice captains, everybody else house captain and prefect. There's only one that was never anything, and it was me. Not that I'm bitter. And my oldest boy, Jake's now there, and he's close to being a prefect. I don't know if he will or he won't, but I say to him, Jakey, I hope you're not, because that'll still mean I'm the only poor bastard.
Yes.
That was not. But my point is that, yes, all of these things that I was, and I am not now, but I certainly would like to live a life. I think I live a life that my mother and father could be proud of, if not my beliefs, at least my values. I think, for me, the strongest value I have is the value of family. And I say to my boys, particularly, as they've gone through, I said, friends will come, friends will go, family is forever. Treasure this. And the greatest thrill I've had on this book is my eldest, Jake, going away on a 10-day excursion to New Guinea and coming back, and he'd read it 4 times. And he was full of questions, but he also, my brothers and sisters talk about, you know, when you were giving my sort of resume, and people say, how do you define yourself? Are you a writer, or are you a formal, whatever? And I know exactly what I am. I'm the youngest FitzSimons of the FitzSimons of Peats Ridge, and all my brothers and sisters feel the same. That is how we define ourselves.
And just finally, the farm at Peats Ridge, is there still a family connection?
When Mum died on 4:05 on July 5, 1994, we all sat around, as I mentioned, for 4 or 5 hours afterwards. And I said to my brothers and sisters, I will own 1% of this farm, or I will own 100% of this farm, but this farm will never be sold. And they all had exactly the same view. And it took a lot of permutations to work out. And really the way we worked it out as a family was almost Marxian, from each according to their means to each according to their needs. So those of us who could afford it have a greater percentage, those who couldn't afford it have a lesser percentage, but our access to it is absolutely equal. Mum's buried there, Dad's buried there, and I love when we're with Mum, there was when 1985, Mum was doing the CWA stalls, and they'd sell anything. And there was this horrible little man on a horrible little horse, a clay sort of sculpture. And Mum was the only person in the whole Central Coast that would pay $15 to save his life. And took him home and put him on the mantelpiece. We all hated it. Anyway, when Mum died, what did we do? We planted the tree above her. And we thought, who can stand silent sentinel on her grave? That horrible little man on the horrible little horse. And he stands there as the years go by on his horse, and, you know, every storm a little bit, you know, his arm fell off, and one point his head fell off, but we put him back. And in the end, it'll be ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But excuse me, that farm will never be sold, and my boys, my daughter, know where I want to be buried. And all my brothers, you know, that's our turf. Mum always said to us, you've got to have your own dung heap. That was her line, your own dung heap, and that's our dung heap.